Literally that way. Literally that way.
Is there a next step? Was it waiting on us? And so it's confirmed there's a date. And if we already decided what that is, because Leslie texted me today. Would you mind sending their cheaper? Should we just get started? Start without the YouTube? Okay. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this. I want to get started by just technology-wise. We are streaming and there are microphones in the ceiling. And so if you are whispering to people throughout this event about whatever, about how great what you're hearing is, about how you really need to read that paper or anything else like that, it will be captured and broadcast to Sergey, Brin, and Larry Page. Thank you for coming. This is the book launch event of How to Disagree Better by Julia Minson, our colleague who is a professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. I'm Todd Rogers. I'm also a professor here, and thank you for coming. I'm going to start with Julia. Tell us about the book.
That's an amazing question, Todd.
Thanks. I mean, it was going to be why write the book, but instead, that's going to be the next question, which is like, give an overview of like, what's the high level, what's the elevator pitch of the book?
Elevator pitch of the book. Okay, so I've been an academic for about 20 years. I've run a lot of studies. I've been lucky enough to publish some of them in academic journals. And it doesn't feel like that's the most impactful way to get information out into the world. I have no Instagram or TikTok talent, so that's not my path either, but I like writing. And so to me, this seemed like a really good way to just take all the ideas and get them to the broadest number of people I could get them to.
Great. So the point of writing the book is to broaden the...
Yes. I think, we have a huge problem with disagreement. I don't know if you all have noticed. Folks are struggling to disagree constructively. And, we notice that the most in our political spaces, right? But certainly if you look at your family life, if you look at your work life, you probably have had some disagreements that didn't go as well as you were hoping they would have gone. And it's a space where we have a ton of information out there, right? Like if you sort of like Google disagreement, there's a lot of advice. And some of it is right and some of it is wrong. And, as behavioral scientists, we're really, really good at figuring out things that work and things that don't. And so there's a big academic literature that tells us things that are true. And I wanted that to be out there available to folks so that we can have better disagreements based on like actual valid behavioral science. I thought that was exciting.
What's wrong? That's interesting. What is out there that goes around that is counterproductive or untrue?
Okay. You're going to get me going. So here's one of the ideas that drives me nuts.
We will eventually talk about things that are true.
Okay.
But in the meantime, what is not?
Okay. The idea, so I spent a lot of time trying to understand why people don't like to engage with opposing perspectives, right? Like, why don't we talk to other people who disagree with us? What is the actual problem? And I feel like every time I've raised this question, and, I'm friends with a lot of academics, and, like I'll sit down to dinner and I'll turn the dinner into a lab meeting and be like, hey, so why do you think people won't listen to opposing views? And the story I would hear over and over is that because it's threatening. And I was like, well, that's weird. What's threatening? Well, you see, because it will give you sort of like this feeling of, cognitive dissonance, and you will start questioning your beliefs. And then, that's really odd because that doesn't sit right. And at some point I was having lunch with my husband, and I told him the story because I turn lunches with my husband into lab meetings too. Right. I'm like, hey, babe, why don't people,
your suggestion for this was we could just turn into a research discussion as a lab meeting. That was also, yeah.
Yeah. My favorite thing in the world is to have a lab meeting. As many people as possible are invited. And so I posed this question to my husband and I explained like these conversations I've had before. And I said, the whole threat thing like doesn't make a lot of sense to me because when I listen to opposing views, I don't feel threatened. I feel annoyed. And he's like, well, Julia, that's because you always think you're right about everything. And I thought, that's true, but also other people think they're right about everything, right? That's not a Julia phenomenon. That's people think they are right about things. And in fact, we have a name in psychology for this. It's naive realism. People naively believe that their perceptions of the world are sort of fundamentally realistic and valid, right? And so what flows from that is that when you talk to somebody who disagrees with your views, you think that they are wrong. You think that they're misinformed or that they're somehow biased by, their self-interest or their background or their bad upbringing, whatever the case may be. They're not, you're not feeling threatened because you're not about to change your mind, right? And so this like narrative of other people feel threatened and that's why they don't want to talk to me is so convenient because it makes us feel good about our arguments and it kind of excuses us from having to have the conversation or having to act any differently in the conversation.
Meaning it's a kindness that I don't want to have this conflictual conversation with you because you'll feel so threatened by the strength of my argument.
Right.
That it'll cause you dissonance and I don't want to do that.
Right. Or when I storm off, it's not because you did anything wrong. It's because I felt so threatened I couldn't take it anymore. Right. So that's like one of the things that is, I think, out there in popular culture that just needs to go away.
That's a good one. Okay, so what does work if we're not threatened? It's not necessarily being threatened, and naive realism isn't the like driver of it. So what's the essence of how do we disagree better?
So this is another sort of thing that I think there's a lot of really good evidence for, and this is a thing that is true. So we talked about what are the things that are true that people happen to believe already, that have a lot of scientific basis behind them. And one of the things that is true is how beneficial it is to conversations when people feel heard, right? So, this is sort of an idea out of like 1950s, humanistic psychology, right? So this is, Carl Rogers, who was one of the early humanistic psychologists who used this idea in therapeutic settings, that you have to make your client feel heard, and then that's going to sort of be transformative. And that idea has gotten very, very broadly exported to a lot of settings. And we now know that when you make people feel heard, right, it de-escalates conflict. If it's in a healthcare setting, people are more likely to follow medical guidance. If it's in a workplace setting, people are less likely to quit, like all sorts of benefits. That piece is true. The piece that seems to be really unclear is how you do this magical thing, right? Because feeling heard is in the eye of the beholder, right? Like I have to feel it. What you have to do in order to make me feel it is a big open question. Right. And often the answer to that question, and certainly this was, part of Carl Rogers's answer initially was, this idea of active listening, right? So like, I'm going to nod, I'm going to smile, I'm going to maybe lean forward. I'll say, turns out that all of that stuff is super easy to fake, right? Like you're nodding, you're smiling. I think you're paying attention. You could be planning like dinner. I don't know, right? Right. We're talking about dinner.
Okay, good. And we both are.
Right. Yeah. So like body language and what people call paralinguistic cues, so that like and all that stuff is super easy to fake because we know exactly how we're supposed to do it. What's a lot harder to fake is actual linguistic signals.
But so we can fake it. Does it work? Meaning like, so I only care if you feel heard. And I know we're going to get to the linguistic, which I've read dozens of your papers on, and I have a sense of.
Thank you.
But But does those aren't the paralinguistic stuff, does that actually work too?
So it's funny, it depends on whether we're in a disagreement or not. So if we are just sort of like sitting there, hanging out, having a nice conversation, you can fake listening with great success, right? So people dramatically overestimate how well the other person is listening, even when they're not listening at all. So we did these really fun studies with Hannah Collins, who was one of my PhD students, where you put two people in a room like this, right? And there is a TV screen behind your head, okay? And you are telling me things, and I'm the participant who received secret instructions. And my secret instructions are listen to your counterpart attentively and don't pay attention to the screen above their head. Or pretend you're listening to your counterpart, do your best to pretend, and memorize. There's like muted commercials playing on the screen, and it's commercials for a bunch of products, and you're supposed to memorize all the products for which you're watching these commercials. And then the third condition is ignore your counterpart completely and just memorize the commercials, okay? And then what we're interested in is, what's your experience?
As the speaker who you are either pretending.
Yes, exactly. So you have no idea anything is happening. Like you walked into this room, there's a screen playing commercials on mute. You're like, I don't know, this is weird. This is psychology study.
What am I talking about? Just whatever I want. The Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah. So the instructions are, imagine you. So these are students in a behavioral lab, right? So we tell them, like, imagine you were to be roommates with this person, get to know them. Right. So it's like a getting to know conversation between strangers. Turns out that the person sort of in Todd's role, who has no clue that anything is happening, can't tell the difference between me totally faking listening versus me doing all the like nodding and smiling, because the person who's faking it knows exactly how to fake it. Right. And so you can imagine a cost, right? Where like if we're in a meeting and I'm like, definitely. And you think I got it, and you think we have a plan, and you think I'm going to go execute the plan. And I am thinking about the Philadelphia Eagles, right? That's very different than if we're in conflict. Turns out that in conflict, so this is work by Bella Wren and Becky Schomburg at Wharton, where what they do is they manipulate whether you are in disagreement or not. And they send people exactly the same message that says, like, you make some set of arguments, I send a response. My response is always the same, so it demonstrates the same amount of listening, except for at the end of the response, it either says, okay, I changed my mind, you're right, or it says, no, I still disagree with you. And if I say that I still disagree with you, I'm rated as a worse listener, even though I said exactly the same thing, right? Because again, sort of like what you get from naive realism is that if I had been truly listening, I would have changed my mind. So the fact that I still disagree is evidence that I did not change my mind, or that I was not really listening, right?
So that makes the linguistic dimension, because the linguistic dimension doesn't have that moderation.
Exactly.
So what are the linguistic features that for if I'm going to pretend to listen?
You're going to pretend to listen. Yeah. So this is the thing, is that with the linguistic features, it's a lot harder to pretend. To get the linguistic features right, you kind of have to listen, right? Because you can think about, what are the ways that you demonstrate with language that you are listening to the other person, right? Well, often it's going to be restating their perspective in a way that they find sort of satisfying, right? Like, yeah, you're saying it right. It can be a callback to a prior conversation, right? I remember last time we talked, you said that you were really concerned about this, that, and the other thing. So I'm not only listening now, I'm still thinking about you in some later conversation, right? Which is nice. Showing that I'm curious about your perspective, again, with my words, right? Like, here's what I believe, but I would really like to understand your point of view, right?
Phrases like that.
Phrases like that, right?
And that, so we can still disagree. I can still say what I disagree on, but expressing curiosity about the other person's.
Right, exactly. So, and I think the we can still disagree thing is something that I find pretty straightforward, but I feel like people find really surprising. I think we have a tendency to see conversation as only having one primary goal, which is I'm going to change your mind. And along the way, I'm going to prevent you from changing my mind. And so the questions I often get when I teach or when I talk is like, well, what's the point of talking to this person if I'm never going to change my mind? Like, I know everything about this topic. I'm never going to change my mind. And I know that they are like a misinformed jerk who is, swimming in a sea of disinformation and, so they're never going to change their mind.
That characterization is your parody of our view of everyone who disagrees with us.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the naive realism.
That's the naive realism, right? So they're never going to change their mind because, they're wrong and they're like too dumb to know that they're wrong. And I'm never going to change my mind because I'm right. Right. And so what is the point of even having this conversation?
So what should we want to disagree with people if we're not going to change their minds?
Yes.
Why? I mean, should we like surface it or should we just avoid it? Is there like productive reasons to disagree if it's not in the service of you moving to the correctness of my position?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it depends. There's more than one reason, right? And so it kind of depends on the situation we're in and why we're having this conversation. So you can imagine in a workplace situation, right? You and I disagree about something, and it could be, it could be that we disagree about politics that we manage to sort of surface in our workplace interaction. It could be that we disagree about an organizational policy in this very, organization that we work in, right? Flex time, working from home, whatever. And often, again, because of naive realism, what that very readily leads to is this idea that Todd is an unreasonable person who just doesn't get it. And I've explained it to him, and I've explained to him a couple times, and he still won't change his mind. And it's always those people in legal who are so obsessed with the I's and the T's and their risk management that they just don't care about the experiences of real people.
Wait,
so I've now made up this whole story about you.
And
you're the guy in legal.
Your burn on me is that I'm a lawyer.
I could have gone somewhere else, but I didn't.
Yeah. All right.
You could be in accounting. Okay. So I have this whole theory of the case that I've constructed in my head that basically comes down to you are not a person that I will now enjoy working with or spending time with because of this thing. And so then, time moves forward and there's another project, there's another opportunity, there's something I need from you, or there's something you need from me. And I have this sort of bad taste in my mouth, right? Because I have made a series of assumptions about you and about your beliefs based on our disagreement. So you can imagine playing it out differently where we have the conversation, right? And you explain to me why you believe what you believe and why you need what you need and, whatever it is. And I'm like, look, I still disagree with you because my life is different. My experiences are different, but I see how a reasonable human being can hold your beliefs, right? And so then again, as, time unfolds, we can work together and we can respect each other and we can be friends while we continue to disagree on this particular thing.
So part of disagreeing better is understanding better, understanding why we disagree. It's not just the performance of I hear you, I can tolerate you.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually trying to understand.
Absolutely. So
now it's my whole pretending work is not going to work. Right.
Yeah. So you do a ton of this work as well, right? People misperceive each other in many different ways, right? And the ways we misperceive each other in disagreement are a subset of the many ways we misperceive each other. And I think a lot of the times we make decisions about other people or about how we should move forward in a certain situation based on inaccurate assumptions. And only through conversation can you correct those assumptions, right? So what we're trying to do is kind of enable the conversation.
Yeah, I could also see in an organization surfacing our disagreements. It like allows us to have a more accurate assessment of what's going on, other people's beliefs, and eventually improving decision making, not by conforming, but by just on better understanding. Because otherwise, we just project. We have this sort of
false consensus. The false consensus effect. Yes.
Okay, you wrote the book. I have two dimensions of what influenced the book, having read it and thought about it. One, there's so much of you in it. There's like from you, like many people may not know that Julia immigrated from Ukraine, which was Russia, Soviet Union, when she was a kid. And like you talk about that and growing with Russian culture and all this other. Tell us about you in the book, but also how your life story affects your interest in this. How is this me search?
Like literally in every imaginable way. Yeah, so you're supposed to tell stories in books. I could have written this like entire book based on the data and the evidence, and the publisher was like, no, you need stories. And and I started thinking about why am I interested in a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it is sort of experiences that I've had. So I was born in Russia, and went back when it was the former Soviet Union, and my dad's side of the family is Russian. My mom's side of the family is Ukrainian Jews. And so because back in the day, it was all one country, we would, I would spend the summers in Ukraine with all my, Ukrainian aunties. And it never sort of occurred to me that, I could never imagine in a million years the war that's happening now. And then I came to the States when I was 12. And the reason we came is because my mom, who was a psychologist, met my stepfather, who was an American psychologist, which, 1989, that kind of thing didn't happen because, 1989, like you got off of an airplane in Russia as an American and you were sort of followed around by, your personal KGB detail. And so we came to the States with this, American stepdad who had kids from his first marriage. And all of a sudden I was like in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, right? So I wasn't in an immigrant community where, other people spoke Russian. I was just like in an American middle school. And, I had American step siblings that, would come over every other weekend, an American stepfather. And
did he speak Russian?
He did not speak a word of Russian. And my mom, interestingly, so she taught herself English because she was studying psychology, which at that time and sort of like largely now is very kind of North America centric. And she wanted to read Stanley Milgram's Obedience Experiments. So she taught herself English to read Milgram, which means that her, like the English she could read was pretty good, but the English she could speak was not much of anything at all. And my mother had a fiery temper. And I remember very sort of early on when my stepfather was, proposing and courting and, they were planning the wedding and whatever, I remember she got very frustrated with him and she couldn't come up with like the right words in English. And my grandmother said, she said, Ina, the fact that you can't speak English will save your marriage. So that was the household I grew up in. It was sort of like this, hot mix of everything. And because of
is that one of the recommendations of the book?
I think
you think that's the wrong solution to disagreement is to like suppress it because the language barrier.
It's the wrong, suppressing it is the wrong thing, but having to think twice is a really good idea, right? So like if you ultimately get there, but you have to, think about it for a bit, that's probably good. And so, and so in Russia, as a kid, I was a competitive ballroom dancer. Okay, here's another piece of revelation that's in the book, which is, in Russia is like a very normal thing for little girls to do. And, it's like doing, ballet or jazz or tap here. It's like all the little kids ballroom dance and all the little girls want to do it. And then the boys are generally forced into it by their parents because their sisters need a partner. So my first dance partnership was this kid who was being forced into it, but his sister was too short for him to dance with because the age difference was too much. So he got stuck with me as his partner. And so like, he hated every minute of being there and he made my life miserable and I made his life miserable. And it was just this like, silent, like it was like the Cold War. It was like a microcosm of the Cold War because we couldn't, yell each other in dance class, but we sure tortured each other quietly as much as we could. And then I came to the States and I wanted to keep doing it. And I ultimately, I kept dancing, I kept training. By the time I was an actual adult, I was teaching dance lessons, and that's how I met my husband. And so we started dancing together, and we fought a lot too, despite the fact that years later, and nobody was sort of pulling each other's ponytail anymore. But and I found that really interesting. I remember thinking about how odd it is that you are sort of in the same physical space. You're listening to the same music. You're literally doing the same steps because you have to, because, you're together, right? And you have entirely different perceptions of what just happened, right? And like, he says you did it and I say he did it. And then, 20 minutes later, you're standing there and, no progress is being made. And like, if this is how people are who are in this very intimately shared experience, what hope is there for the rest of us? So I want to get a PhD.
So the conflict part of that is everyone else here may be expert in ballroom dancing.
Probably.
But you're saying you like do a dance and then you like debrief and that's where conflict happens? Is that like, so you guys are disagreeing and vigorously, despite being dance partners, successful dance partners, and ultimately loving each other enough to be married for however long.
Right. And it's very, like probably most people have never watched a ballroom dancing competition, but we all watch like, Olympic figure skating, right? And so you imagine like, you're moving fast, there's momentum, you lose balance and like, it's not like you finished a dance and you take a bow and then you sit down with your notes. It's like you pull apart in the middle of it and, yeah. And there's always other people too. It's always public because there's a dance studio and there's a bunch of people practicing. And so there's always witnesses to this whole thing, which is also an interesting sort of commentary on conflict and the way it unfolds.
So the conflict is under observation.
Yes, that's right. Which,
that probably tempers it.
Right. Just like social media is really good for conflict.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and you're writing about how to disagree better. And there's a lot of scenarios where we disagree in our personal lives, and we've talked about some. How is the Kennedy School relevant or shaped the kinds of questions you ask, and or how is this relevant to our students and alums who are policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of what we were talking about earlier, right, is that disagreeing well at work is incredibly important. Disagreeing well is incredibly important for decision making. Like, I think I was emphasizing more the relational benefits of it. You pointed out the piece about making mistakes, right? And there's, a huge literature about the importance of diverse perspectives and diverse opinions for avoiding catastrophic errors under uncertainty. Right? Most of what our students go into as policymakers is making decisions under uncertainty. So I think there's sort of that piece of it. There is.
Wait on that one. I'm thinking of obviously there's like leaders can set organizational cultures that are more or less receptive, and I don't want to use receptive because actually it's a technical meaning, but like more or less surfacing of disagreement. And there's talk like you can Amy Edmondson, psychological safety, whatever. you're talking not relevant to the leaders, but actually practically, tactically, how to disagree without it feeling explosive.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, the psychological safety piece of it is interesting, right? Because psychological safety is like, as a team member, right? The extent to which I feel comfortable asking questions and admitting mistakes, right? Which is a very important thing to be able to do. The question is, how do we get it?
Yeah.
Right? How do we get at something? And I really think about disagreement in an organization or in a community as sort of a dynamic system. And I think this is very relevant to the work we're doing at the Kennedy School through the Candid and Constructive Conversations Initiative. It's very relevant to the work that is happening more broadly around Harvard, which is that, you take a whole bunch of people in a room, right? They're going to have different preferences for how much confrontation they enjoy, right?
Confrontation is the word. So confrontation is different than disagreement. Confrontation is like a different axis. We can disagree without it being confrontation.
Exactly, exactly, right. So let's say we're sitting there in a classroom and, the professor put some controversial topic in front of us. And so if they chose their material well, roughly half the students will agree with it, roughly half the students will disagree with it, right? Like, there is a presence of disagreement before anybody said anything. And some people, and we all know who those people are like, yeah, let's go, right? And they are the people who enjoy the confrontation, right? So they speak up, they kind of say it out loud, they say it very directly, right? Like they imply very clear judgments in how they communicate. And that makes other people who are maybe on the other side of this continuum be like, oh, hell no, I'm not getting into this.
Right.
Right? Like, no, thank you.
Underneath it all, the disagreement is
disagreement exists.
Yeah.
Right. And so you believe things, you think things, you're not sharing them, you're not feeling like your opinion is being elicited, right? And so there's an interesting dynamic where I think a lot of the times what we do in organizations is we tell the quiet people to speak up. Like, you should have more courage and you should speak up, right? And that's, I think, a big hurdle, right? Because it's not an environment into which you want to speak up. Now, if you tell the confrontational people to pipe down, you are now sort of policing speech. Right? And that's not good either. So can you create an environment where people say what they want to say, but in a way that makes other folks feel like their views are welcome, right? And that you're not going to sort of start a big hoopla by speaking up.
I don't know that I've ever, maybe you've written about it, I haven't seen it. Gender and this, are there not natural, but pre-existing gender differences in receptiveness, which is the construct that Julia will writes about and has developed. And then are there different consequences to receptive or unreceptive communications by gender? Because
So hot off the presses, Harvard research. I haven't written about it because it's brand new. So one of the things that we've known for a while is that if you take men and women and you ask them to write a message to somebody they disagree with, and you give them sort of like no training or instructions of any kind, women express themselves with greater receptiveness, right? So you can sort of measure it algorithmically, you can feel it differently in the tone, and and we can have sort of a whole conversation absent of any data about nature, nurture, culture, whatever, right? But women express themselves with greater receptiveness. The new data that I think is really interesting and startling is that if you train people and label the messages as coming from a man or from a woman, and then you ask people to evaluate the writers, the men get more credit.
For being receptive.
So everybody likes receptive. Receptive is good, but coming from a man, it's even better.
So it put differently, unreceptive communication, women get punished for more. Or
Yeah.
is that not in the data you're talking about? It's not just the inverse of what you said.
I don't think it's the inverse of what
Okay,
I said, but I
alright.
have to look at the control conditions.
But men get rewarded. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like if a man takes a kid to school.
Right. Yeah.
What a good dad.
Exactly. And there's other data that's not mine that measures receptiveness a little bit differently, but kind of same idea, where people in positions of power get rewarded more for being receptive. So I think those things kind of go together. I think so. The story in my mind is something like it's a violation of expectations, and it's sort of like, well, you don't have to be doing this, but you're doing it anyway, so that makes you a nice person.
So if people think you're not receptive, if you come off as unreceptive, but you communicate in a receptive way, then it's like, what a gem of a person.
Right, you're trying so hard. You're working so hard.
That's interesting. Okay. In sectors, industries, problem areas, concretely, Julie and I were talking. I sometimes work with organizations on communication. I was working with a large family of investment funds on writing better. And they're like, what we really would love you to talk about is how we can disagree better. Because I may think that I'm right, but it turns out the market is going to determine whether we're right 6 to 12 months from now. It'd be better if we could surface and benefit from everyone's perspective. But instead, the leader says something and everyone else falls in line. It's like, that's such a good idea.
Right.
And the truth is going to come out. That's one set. And I said, I know just the person you need to work with. And so hopefully they will be reaching out to you and paying you.
If anybody knows any other large families of investment funds, you just feel free to pass along the introduction.
Exactly.
Don't be shy.
That was when I was like, but I can tell you how to write a short email. But but they really need you. We're working on it. A small 25% commission. But what other sectors? So let's go healthcare, legislation, obviously there are more than those two sectors.
Healthcare, education, media.
Okay, go through. Yeah.
So half the book is healthcare examples, in part because, as an immigrant with elderly relatives, I've been in every sort of ridiculous healthcare interaction you could possibly imagine. And
part of that is because you are tending to people who don't speak comfortably in English and navigating the healthcare system.
Right. And the healthcare system is crazy, right?
Yes.
And I mean, this is where, your stuff on, writing for busy readers. I mean, I would look at these, letters from the insurance company or the doctor's office, and I'm thinking, I have a PhD. I speak fine English. I barely understand.
Yeah.
My grandmother is an immigrant, but she used to be a writer. And her English was pretty damn good, and she still doesn't understand. And how are people supposed to do this, right? Anyway, so my frustrations with healthcare can fill another book, but it is, I believe, the largest employer in the United States right now, kind of the entire sector. We have hundreds of thousands of physicians, we have nurses, we have aides, we have, just a massive infrastructure full of incredibly stressed out people.
So all of this is also, if you do consulting gigs in the healthcare sector, then where should they reach you? No, I'm just, okay. So the points where they poorly disagree.
Right. So, you can't do healthcare sort of with one person, right? Every healthcare encounter involves a provider and a patient. And that patient will inevitably have opinions, right? And it's going to be, doctor, give me antibiotics for my COVID because my sister got antibiotics for her COVID and she feels better, right? You're not supposed to give antibiotics for COVID as far as I understand it. But people sort of insist on it because, doctor, I've done my own research, right? There is a tremendous amount of disagreement between providers, right? Because quite often, especially when a patient is admitted, it becomes a team sport, right? So you are, you're the attending, but you need like a, cardiology consult, or you need a GI consult, or you need whatever. So you need a different person from a different service to come over and do something for your patient. They often also have opinions. So the amount of conflict is constant, and it's part of, there's been sort of a huge problem with burnout since the pandemic, right? And obviously, like, there's big structural reasons, and that whole, deadly pandemic being a part of it. But the way in which workplace stress and workplace conflict contributes to it, from what I understand, is sort of like very real. And we put so much work into educating our healthcare providers on, the biology of it all, but educating them on conversations around disagreement. I think there's very, very little being done right now.
So the healthcare outcome, let's say the patient-doctor COVID example, what does success look like? Does success feeling like I'm a patient who's done my research, my doctor's doesn't understand that COVID causes, or the vaccine causes autism,
right,
or whatever.
Right.
So you as a doctor, like, I feel understood, we disagree. So success, at least, like, it's definitely more than nothing for me to be like, my doctor understands me, I'll come back, or something. But it could also be changing my mind, but that's not the problem you're solving.
So, so we have actually, we've spent years trying to understand, because where you're getting to is persuasion and attitude change.
Yeah.
When does receptiveness actually change people's beliefs?
Which, just first order, is not the problem you're trying to solve.
It is not the problem I'm trying to solve, but everybody wants to know that answer.
But I just, like, it's an important one that it took me a while talking to you over the last decade, that, like, just accepting disagreement in a world where disagreement leads to hostility and conflict, just accepting that we disagree is a sufficient goal.
Well, and, back to the healthcare example, right? And this is, like, again, my sort of experience with, the Russian relatives. You go to the doctor tells you something you don't want to hear. You're like, yes, doctor, okay. You ask some questions, they're like, no, you're wrong, like, just do this. And then what they did, this is what my grandparents did, is they just never went back to the doctor, right? So you don't take the pills, and you don't go back to the doctor. And I'm like, go back to the doctor, ask for different pills. Oh, no. That would be rude, right? And I think what happens with, in many cases, and COVID vaccines are a perfect example, is if you don't, as a patient, if you don't feel respected, and if you don't feel heard, and if you don't feel understood, right, you don't go back to the doctor, right? And so then you're like walking around the world unvaccinated, but you're also walking around the world with all the other things that are going on in your body, where you're not getting sort of enough care. So I think my primary goal is keep the person in the conversation.
That's a success. Proximal success is continued interaction and tolerance of each other.
Continued interaction, tolerance, trust, right? So we spend I've spent a lot of time working with sort of different medical groups. They're like obsessed with rebuilding trust. And we have a lot of evidence that shows that this approach increases ratings of trustworthiness. And then back to the persuasion question, because people do want to know the answer, and I really want to give them the answer. We have run tons of studies. So this is work with David Hagman, who is in Hong Kong, and Kara Liu, who is at Stanford. Tons and tons of studies where we can't find the moderator. Sometimes receptiveness is just explicitly more persuasive. Sometimes it's equally persuasive. It is never less persuasive. So on average, it's the dominant strategy. We can't figure out why sometimes it's more and sometimes it's equal. Stay tuned.
Do you have a hypothesis?
I have had so many hypotheses. Oh my God, I have had so many hypotheses, and then like one after the other, they've crumbled. So I no longer have hypotheses about this.
Okay.
We need to ask some audience questions.
Good. Well,
yeah.
Okay. We'll get wherever the audience will ask the next question. You were talking. What is the next frontier of this work that you would like to do? And then we'll start taking audience questions.
So I said healthcare, education, and media.
Oh, applied.
Applied because I think that a big, I like this new term I heard recently. I guess it's only new to me. It's not new to anybody else. Implementation science. I love the idea of implementation science because I think sometimes we talk about applied work as like, an afterthought. But with this stuff, I have some very, very genuine questions about like, what do we have to do to people to make it stick at scale, right? And I don't know the answer. So a lot of the work we're doing is, can we take a very robust dose of this and see if we can actually change behavior over time and change behavior at scale? I think that's going to be hard.
And change is the interaction style.
Yes.
That's what internalizing and sustaining.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Cool. Let's take questions from the audience. If people have questions for Julia Minson. That's her
question right there. I see a hand.
Jacob.
Hi, Julia, thanks for this. So the question, so I've just started in a new role 6 months ago, and often I'm in one-on-one situations where the other person disagrees with me. And the way to handle that is by showing that I'm open to change and being flexible. Now I'm finding myself in rooms with 5 to 10 people where half the room disagrees with me, but the other half not only agrees with me, they almost expect me to represent them. And the more flexibility I show in my perspective, I win half the room and I'm losing the other half and I don't quite know how to handle it.
Okay. I love that question. Delon over there really loves that question because this is her line of research.
Actually, and can you introduce yourself and your connection to this? We'll do this for all the question askers.
I'm Jacob Xavier. I just graduated from the 2-year program last summer, and I'm a Bloomberg City Hall Fellow working with the mayor of a small town in the Midwest.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. So part of what, is sort of fascinating about the way you phrased the question is you said, I am showing that I'm flexible and I'm open to change, which I don't know that you need to be open to change. You just need to be open to understanding where this other person is coming from, right? So I could say something like, I think that the flu vaccine is really important and beneficial to your health. And like, I can't imagine changing my mind about that, but I recognize that you disagree. And I'm really curious to hear about the experiences that have led you to not want to get vaccinated for the flu. Like, tell me about your thinking, right? So I've made it clear that, the sun would have to rise in the West for me to change my mind about the flu, but I truly want to understand your perspective. And so I think, and so with some of the studies that we've done with Delon and another PhD student we had here, Molly Moore, what we normally find is that when people are very receptive, even though they're being sort of very clear about what they believe, they don't lose either side of the room, right? Because I'm just engaging, I'm not signaling that I'm willing to abandon my people.
And that protects the side that because I shook my head vigorously because that's such a good question of like the fear that I have about appearing receptive. Is that an observer is going to think that I agree with this abhorrent position? Yeah. And you're saying by I can, in the disagreement, say, I disagree vigorously. It is hard to imagine I could ever agree with you. Right. But I do want to understand how you could get there and hold such terrible views. That's Delon's version. That is roughly
so
that.
Temper
the language.
Who's amazing at this? I mean, there's lots of people who are amazing at this, but I was listening to Ezra Klein recently, and he had like a former Obama guy talk about the Iran war, and then he had a former Trump, like national security person, talk about the Iran war, and he started the second episode with like, I don't agree with this position, but I think we should really explore it and truly understand it. And then for an hour, he asked like really thoughtful, non-confrontational, reasonable questions. And I was like, I want to just bottle that.
Yeah, that's all right.
So many hands. You can go here and then here.
Sure. My name is Julian. I'm PhD student at Northeastern, but I work here at the Growth Lab as well. Early on, you mentioned in workplace confrontations that the downsides of this are if someone disagrees vigorously, people disagree, you develop this kind of judgment about the person, or you evolve some stereotype about a group of people like that person. Is the only reason that kind of disagreement is bad just because you don't have future collaboration? Or like, is there some other reason that's bad?
I mean, it could be, lack of future collaboration. It could be that you're just wrong.
In the workplace setting.
Yeah, in the workplace setting. So you are, you have misjudged the person and you have misjudged their motives. I see this fairly regularly, like, when people ask me for sort of negotiation support and they say, this person won't do this, that, or the other thing that I really need them to do. And I'm like, well, have you asked them why they won't do it? It's like, well, I already know. They're this kind of person, right? I'm like, but you don't know, right? And I think we are often so like enamored with our hypotheses about other people that we don't ask the questions that could help us solve the problem we're currently having. So I think, sort of failing to negotiate deals that are possible, I think is one of the consequences. Did you have something else in mind?
Well, it just feels like that still grounds out in lack of future collaboration. Like the team isn't working together, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other negative outcome of this? Or?
I mean, not getting work done and not having good relationships to me covers like a lot of costs.
Yeah, I guess in a workplace environment, it's probably more important. But in the general public, if you are kind of an acquaintance with someone, you have a conversation like this, you decide, I don't really like them.
Mm-hmm.
Is there really any downside? Maybe not.
Yeah, so that's a totally valid point, and I think this is back to the like question about are some topics or some people just not worth it? Some topics and some people are just not worth it. That's fine. Like I think we should be making thoughtful choices about what we expose ourselves to and where we spend our time and our energy. I would say that in many cases, we make that decision too quickly and with insufficient information. And again, through like a whole host of, psychological biases that lead us to conclude that this person is further from us and has less merit than maybe we would discover if we talk to them. And so if this person is somebody you are in a relationship with, that discovery may be worth it, right? If this person is sort of a rando on the street, that discovery may not be worth it. I know a lot of people who get into some very, very difficult conversations, right? So people with, sort of marginalized identities, people who have had some very traumatic experiences, who really like put themselves out there to talk to people who many of us would consider sort of beyond the pale, because they think that it is their mission to have these conversations, right? Because kind of the theory of the case is that if you sort of disdain somebody and judge them and shame them, they're very unlikely to change their mind, right? And so what else can we do? So, but it's a choice.
Can I build on that? If one desirable outcome is continuing the discussion, that could be a metaphor for continuing the democratic experiment that we have of being able to continue discussion as one political body, when we disagree with people deeply, but still express receptiveness, even if we're never going to change each other's minds, just tolerating each other and continuing the conversation.
Right. See, this is why they pay you the big bucks, those kinds of connections, because that's exactly it. That's like the big picture, but you got there and you said it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, we're sitting in the Kennedy School of
There's one more hand over here. Yeah.
Khalil Walji, physics scholar at MIT. I work sort of at the interface of local communities in the global tropics, mostly around high forested landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
So our work there is around a little bit on behavior change, but looking at how they make decisions on what they plant, the amount of biodiversity they'll conserve versus making alternate choices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very interesting conversation. So thank you both. I've written down about 15 questions. I'm going to ask you. Yeah, so my first question was around this idea of storytelling, and you used it in your book as a how much do you feel is that utilized as a strategy for disagreement or finding perspective from other from those who are potentially in conversation or in disagreement? And then my second question is around is there a minimum threshold of trust that allows us to disagree? I don't know if it's frequency of interaction or the number of times that we've seen one another first before we can get into constructive disagreement. And before that, it's just sort of pseudo community where we're not gonna get into a constructive disagreement. I don't know if those are topics you touch on in yours.
Yeah, so I mean, the storytelling thing is great. There's a lot of research on storytelling in like marketing and advertising, right? So we have been using stories for influence for a very, very long time. And there's a lot of practice of storytelling, right? Sort of like in the world of mediation, in the world of peace building, people sit down in a circle and tell their stories. And it's only recently that there has been an academic literature looking at, is storytelling an effective tool for overcoming conflict? And there's a few papers in this space. One of them is my paper with David Hadman and Kathy Tinsley. And what we find is that storytelling is effective when it reveals a vulnerability, which is very much in line with all the other stuff about, question asking and showing curiosity. Like all of those are sort of, in some sense, low status behaviors, right? Like I'm going to tell you about the really difficult time I had with, this particular thing. And that's why I have such strong objections, right? It's not because here's a spreadsheet of data that shows that you're wrong and I'm right. It's because I'm really scared about taking this path again because I had a bad time last time, right? And so that feels like a very sort of vulnerable, low status thing that I think people struggle to do unless they're coached to do it. But it does seem to kind of build trust. And I can't remember your second question.
The second question was this idea of the responsibility to disagree also sits in the kind of system that you're in. And so trust becomes something that needs to be built before we can.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it needs to be built before, because I think it goes both directions. But sometimes I think what happens is it's harder to disagree with the people we're close with, right? So because there's more there to break. Right. And so on one hand, you sort of trust this person to maybe not hurt you, but at the same time, you don't want to hurt them. So I'm not actually totally clear about that.
We have time for one more question, I think.
All right.
Hi, my name is Marcus. I'm a former Neiman Fellow. I'm in the media.
My third favorite sector.
So I've had experience and I appreciate your term naive realism. We are sort of on the dagger's edge when it comes to weaving in and out of everybody's naive realism. And like in my situation, it's like, I found that in the past, I've covered conflicts. So I've interviewed people on the side of people waging war and the people being, having war come to their doorsteps and having to defend themselves. And now it seems like we live in a world where everybody's outsized naive realism won't let us talk to them, because even like his point, if I signal to them that, that I am sort of trying to listen, I could be on their side, right? So, and I'm not necessarily wanting to be on anybody's side. I'm just trying to listen, but they want us to, so my question is like, how do we break down naive realism? It's
$1 million question. It is $1 million question. I mean, I think the media situation obviously is gotten much more complicated since the advent of social media. And the way it contributes to naive realism is that I can fully surround myself with people who think exactly the way I think. Right. And so, back in the day, you used to have to talk to people you disagreed with because they sort of lived next to you, right? And they went to school with you. And now that so much of our dialogue is online, I'm constantly served affirmation of my own rightness. It's really shocking when I come across people who disagree. And because it's so rare and so shocking, it is that much easier to conclude that this person, has no clue. Right. So I think the online environment has made things much worse. We have a nice paper that, again, Delon and I wrote with Charlie Dorison and Nancy Gibbs, where we actually compared, we collected a bunch of op-eds from both left-leaning and right-leaning outlets, and measured how receptive the language was in each op-ed and then showed it to readers on both sides. And we actually found that readers really appreciate receptive language. And readers, so like, let's say you're the New York Times, right? So you're a left-leaning outlet, and we measure lean by sort of the proportion of your readership that leans a particular way. So, right, so most New York Times readers are left-leaning readers. So let's say you're the New York Times. If you publish an op-ed that has more receptive language in it, certainly conservative readers appreciate it, right? That's not surprising because they sort of feel heard and engaged. What's surprising and interesting is that liberal readers also like it. They don't like it as much as the conservative readers like it, but they like it. They don't resent it. And then the people who really love it is the middle of the road people. So we have, so it's one paper, but we are starting to see a little bit of evidence that this approach could help in those situations. I'm gonna keep digging.
We're gonna stick around and you're gonna be around for a few minutes?
Yes.
And I think we'll wrap it with that. As this conversation advanced, especially with the questions, I started thinking that how to disagree better. If we're to love our neighbors, love people we disagree with, love our enemies, it's like disagree. If the goal is to continue relationships, disagreeing better, how to love better. With that, Julia, thank you for teaching us all this, and thanks for writing the book.
Thank you.
5 books to give away and a raffle.